It's time now for the KC Ingram Show on WSTU. The opinions expressed are those of the program host and guest and not necessarily those of WSTU. WSTU does not endorse products that may be mentioned. Any reproduction or retransmission of this broadcast is strictly prohibited without written consent of WSTU. It's time to call in with your questions and comments at 220-9788, 220-WSTU. And now, here's KC Ingram.
Tired of lines at the boat launch, sun damage, or not using your boat because of the hassle? Call Meridian Marina and Yacht Club because we do all the work so you can enjoy your boating lifestyle. We store your boat inside, launch it with a wash with just 30 minutes notice, and rinse it down before putting it back. Need new electronics, service, detailing, bottom paint? No problem. Our experienced certified techs will make sure your boat is in tip-top shape and ready to head to the sandbar, fishing, or the Bahamas. Call us up at 772-221-8198. That's 221-8198, or visit us online at meridianmarina.com. Well, good evening, Stuart and beyond, as we're on Facebook Live. This evening, we have a great show on tap once again. I have a repeat guest. I have Dr. Jesse Sagner in the studio this evening. How are you doing, Dr. Sagner?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me
Well,
again.
I certainly appreciate you coming back. And if you've read the preview to the show, Dr. Sagner co-authored a paper, South Florida's Brightline, the Public Cost of Private Rail, that was written early last year, 2018, and then published in the fall. And since then, you've also put together a presentation about this very topic. And throughout this paper, we're going to discuss tonight in particular the structure of All Aboard Florida, Brightline, Virgin Trains, Florida East Coast Industries, and Fortress and beyond. So I really appreciate you coming in this evening to discuss this. And we're going to be showing some visuals on the Facebook Live, so you can certainly look at those later if you are listening to this by radio. So, Dr. Sagner, let's start out. Why did you write this paper?
So part of it was when my colleague and I, we looked at the overall structure of how this project was actually funded. And it was pretty fascinating because that story wasn't really being told. So it was more, here's Brightline, it's going to be a high-speed rail. Ideally, it's going to move people around. But exactly how everything was going to be funded and the structure of the overall project, that was never really discussed in any detail. So we spent a lot of time trying to find what little information there was out there.
Indeed.
Because ultimately, this is a private project, and it's very difficult to find information. So a lot of it was heavily redacted.
Correct.
Where we had to put the pieces together almost forensically to come up with the paper we wrote.
You're absolutely right about that. I remember the first RIF loan application that they put out. We did a public records request on it, and it was very heavily redacted. It was a bunch of black bars for the most part. And then we learned a little bit more with the private activity bonds. And then we learned a little bit more here with the recent SEC filings. So it's kind of been like pulling a curtain back, behind the wizard there. So and you wrote this paper before the SEC filing. So,
correct.
It was a lot of research for you. One of the reasons why I wanted to bring you in was to particularly talk about the organizational structure. Can you go in? Let's start right now. It's a Virgin Train. So I'll let you start either from the top or the bottom, however you want to characterize that.
I don't know if there's a best place to start. In all honesty, the organizational structure for this project has changed multiple times.
Yes.
And part of that gives you some idea for the fact that they're still trying to figure out how to finance it, and they're having probably a variety of other issues that are not publicly known. So because of that, the organizational structure has changed multiple times. There's been Grupo Mexico, you've got SoftBank in Japan. So now you have international companies coming in. And so ultimately the way it was originally structured has changed drastically to how it is structured now. And even since we wrote the paper in late fall, it has changed again with Virgin Atlantic becoming basically a branding partner in the overall, I guess, structure of things.
Right. So can you explain to us with the passenger train itself, with the funding? We know that Virgin Trains have come in. They're trying to introduce an IPO. I just got a late message. I haven't read it yet, but I heard the IPO has been delayed for release tomorrow. I'm not sure what's going on there. But let's say that the IPO is released, that Virgin Trains does get some funding. Who is going to be responsible if this train goes bankrupt? Who's going to be responsible for that bankruptcy? Who's the one that takes the loss? Is it?
So ultimately, anybody that invests in it, they take the loss, essentially. The way it's set up is anything invested in the passenger part of this project, if that should fail, they get nothing. And that doesn't mean that everything just stops, because they also have, the way they've structured it is that if the passenger rail goes away, the freight side of it is still fine. They're sort of a whole different entity. And one of the only things that really connects us together is the dispatch aspect, because you want one person overseeing the use of the rails for passenger and freight. So you only want one person communicating that, which makes sense. But if the passenger side of this project were to fail, ultimately it would just become a freight project. And the freight project would be extremely lucrative in terms of the additional freight coming in through the Port of Miami, Port Everglades, and so on. So overall, if the passenger side fails, the rest of the company can basically continue to function. And so the collateral is all within the passenger side. So in other words, if it fails, you can have one of the passenger trains. Most people don't have much use for that.
Right.
And so you can see why the passenger side, if that fails, then it's sort of self-contained in terms of the damage for everybody except for the investors.
Certainly, except for the investors. And what's interesting about that is, we'll go back and we'll explain again. SoftBank purchased Fortress, which was the original owner of Florida East Coast Railway, Florida
Right.
East Coast Industries, all aboard Florida. They were a hedge fund in New York City.
Right.
SoftBank is actually a Japanese-owned company.
Correct.
However, when they purchased Fortress, at the same time, Florida East Coast Railway, the freight division, was auctioned off, and Grupo Mexico, a Mexican-owned company, of course, purchased the Florida East Coast Railway.
Correct.
So now you have a Mexican-owned freight system,
Right.
and a Japanese-owned, ultimately, passenger system running on the same line,
Correct.
looking for American dollars to fund it.
That is correct. And it's made this an international project of sorts. And what's interesting is Grupo Mexico, we might be talking about this a little bit later, but Grupo Mexico actually owns freight lines in Texas as well as on the West Coast. So in terms of this niche of owning the Florida railroads, they would have access to 3 of the largest ports in terms of tonnage that are brought in on freight in the entire United States. So in other words, Miami's port upgrades have basically enabled them to take the largest possible ships coming through the Panama Canal and offload that freight. So you're talking about ships twice the size of the older ships that used to come through the Panama Canal. So with that, they have Grupo Mexico can control the freight that comes in through Florida.
That's actually incredible if you think about it, because it's the entire East Coast. And then you were saying beyond, they have some other lines throughout the United States. Let's go ahead and talk about that a little bit more, because that's really a big deal for Grupo Mexico. Should this line get double tracked?
Right.
If the passenger rail doesn't succeed, it goes bankrupt. You cannot hand back the double tracking. It's going to remain there.
They stay. Exactly.
So, and that's really a big advantage. And I know you had an excellent chart. I don't know, Iggy, if we have that or not, that showed, I think it was number 14, that kind of showed the gateway from Grupo Mexico to the United States.
Right. So basically, the FEC rail line goes from Miami to Jacksonville. So the 4 largest ports, Jacksonville, Port Everglades, the port in Palm Beach, and Port Miami, those all have direct access to the Florida East Coast rail line in terms of freight. So what the Grupo Mexico purchase does of that rail line is it means that any freight coming in on the east coast of Florida, which has ports that can accommodate these huge tankers from Panama or coming through the Panama Canal, they basically control access to goods brought in through Florida to the entire east coast of the United States. And it's one of the reasons why investors were basically investing a lot of money in Grupo Mexico, because it's very lucrative. They basically own the gateway on the eastern seaboard to get goods throughout the entire eastern, midwestern, southern United States.
Now, you talked about how lucrative actually Grupo Mexico or Florida East Coast Railway is compared to other rail lines here in the United States.
Right.
And I'll let you expand on that a little bit.
And I mean, it's, to put it simply, on a per mile basis, the amount of freight revenue generated from the Florida East Coast Railroad makes it the most profitable freight railroad in the entire United States.
Incredible.
So from that perspective, and that story hasn't really been told at all.
Right.
It's all been, we'll focus on Brightline because Brightline was seen as a public good, which helped secure the $600 million in private activity bonds. So it was kind of like, look at the passenger side of this, and it's going to do a lot to reduce congestion. But then when you look at the financial side of the freight implications of Florida East Coast industries being bought by Grupo Mexico, you see the dollar signs are much larger. But that doesn't support the passenger side if the passenger side fails. That's standalone.
It is. It's a very interesting proposition. And one thing that I find interesting is typically freight companies do not like to have passenger trains running on the same line because the freight trains go slower.
Right.
Passenger lines are quicker. It's hard to have two trains running different speeds on the same line. And it's the freight train that has to pull over and let the faster train through. So, right now there's been 14 deaths, I believe, with the Florida or the all-board Florida Virgin train. When that happens, it stops the tracks. They have to,
Right.
take care of the accident. And I find it very interesting that Grupo Mexico has always been very quiet. They've never said anything about the delays or anything. But as you say, in the end, they would be the ones that end up with the big benefit of double tracking should this get funded and the passenger train is able to lay that second track.
Right.
Let's talk a little bit. I found it very interesting, Iggy, back to number 4, how to get to Orlando. You talked a lot about going by plane, train, and automobile.
Right. And so my colleague, Eric Dunbar, who co-wrote the paper with me, he's the one who calculated these figures. So he's got a background in transportation, but it basically looks at the costs. And the idea in terms of train, those figures are based on how much Brightline is supposed to cost at some point in time. So it's right now, it's heavily incentivized to get passengers to use Brightline. So this figure of $91, $182, that might be how much they'd have to charge in the future in order to be profitable or at least break even, assuming that all of their cars are completely sold out.
And that is going from Miami to Orlando, correct?
Correct.
So and that's one way?
That 91 is one way, 182 is round trip.
Round trip. $91 one way from Miami to Orlando, folks. You know what you're paying for tickets today between West Palm and Miami. And a couple weeks ago, I had Mr. Mark Mueller on, who studied the bond issue, the financing issue. And I believe in the SEC filing, I'm going from memory here a little bit, the train had specified they thought they were going to be charging around $50 a ticket.
Right.
So not covering cost.
Right. So in terms of the cost, it's still rapidly fluctuating. So in terms of the true cost of actually riding it, we know that it's not enough based on how much revenue they've lost so far. But in terms of, well, what's that sweet spot in terms of the perfect number? I think it's probably much higher than any of us know. But if they were to reveal that, it would be very difficult for them to get investors and additional funding that they're trying to get right now.
Well, certainly, Dr. Sagner, and they have tried over and over again to reissue and sell these private activity bonds. The idea with the private activity bonds is that if you were to make money with them, you don't have to pay the tax on the money you made with them. So it's a great deal for investors if the project makes money and you get a return on investment.
Right.
Problem here, investors are not seeing a return on investment, so they're having great difficulty selling these private activity bonds, and that's where we are today. And now they're trying the IPO, the stock offering, and hoping to at least raise $600 million so they can retire the initial bonds that they did sell with collateral.
Right.
Second set of bonds don't have collateral, so that's why they're still available. But would you just state here, and I'm going to let you look at this, but the plane, train, and auto cost, what he figured out, because this is the most incredible piece of information that I saw. The train is the most expensive out of those 3 options.
Correct. So in other words, the plane option, and this is based on figures that we actually looked at when we did the article. So these aren't sort of hypothetical academic calculations, but based on actual fares. So the plane one way was $65, or round trip was $130. And sure, you have to deal with delays related to security and all those other fun things. And you have the additional cost of parking or transportation to and from the airport, not just from whichever airport you fly up down here, but also once you get to Orlando Airport, where are you going and how are you getting there? In terms of the third option, that's just hopping in your car and driving. You might spend $35 in gas, depending on how efficient your car is. And so round trip, it would be $70. And we used a figure of roughly $4 per gallon. And then there's $19 in tolls, assuming you take the toll road. And then you also have to worry about the cost of parking. So when you look at the costs, I mean, the benefits aren't necessarily there because you still have to figure out from the airport, where are you going and how do you get there?
Correct. And the big thing between the auto and the train or the plane is if you're a family of 4, it's still going to be $35.70 for the auto.
Right.
Family of 4 on the train, that's $91 per person one way.
Exactly. Yes.
So it's very interesting when you start breaking down the figures. And it also, I think that investors are seeing this, and that's why the bonds haven't sold, and we'll see how the stock sells as well.
Right.
With the bonds, you also talk about, and this is going on to number 5, Iggy, if they default. I'll talk to you a little bit about that. You talk about historical failure.
Right. So historically, when these private activity bonds have failed, it was largely due to the fact that the costs were too high, meaning that the actual cost of the projects were so high that whatever revenue was coming in couldn't even come close to matching it. So there's that issue. Another issue is on the projection side related to ridership. And again, for any one of these transportation related projects, they always focus on the ridership revenue. And so if that's been too low, then that's also been one of the reasons for failure. And then the other thing, which some of the figures related to if you fly or if you were to drive yourself to Orlando, is that the option that's being put out to the general public isn't as competitive as other options, such as just getting in your car and driving. And you can go exactly where you want to go.
And be able to leave when you want to leave. And
Exactly.
if you have to make a pit stop to a grocery store for something special, you can do that.
Exactly.
And
Right.
people like to do that. You just talked about the ridership, and that's one of the risks. Number 8, Iggy, the company is relying on estimates of third-party consultants regarding the future ridership and revenue, operations and maintenance cost, and ancillary revenue of the company's proposed passenger rail service to build the company's projections. And these estimates may prove to be inaccurate. Actual results could differ from the projections and other estimates.
Right.
And really, that's proven to be true.
It has. And again, if you look at the background of any large public-private, not even public-private, because this is technically private, but if you look at the project histories, the ridership projections have been off on all of them. I'd say probably 98% of them have been off by enough where it's had some sort of impact on the actual project costs and revenue. So in terms of saying that, well, the numbers could be wrong, part of it is the original company that did these projections, their expertise was not in transportation modeling and projections and ridership revenue type things. So part of it was the company that they relied on for some of these figures didn't have a really strong background in ridership projections. So to some extent, their risks are saying, well, you know what? We could have a relatively sound idea, but because these projections are wrong, that's why it's going to fail.
Very interesting. It's the way to pass the buck as to why
it
it's
is.
failure.
Right. It is.
We were relying on their guidance, and their guidance wasn't correct. So,
Right.
absolutely. And that's something you had talked a little bit more here about risk and cost overruns and delays in the completion of the north segment, as well as difficulties in obtaining requisite approval or sufficient financing to pay for such costs and delays.
Right.
Truly, that's a huge one, isn't it, Dr. Sagner? I mean, the financing really has been an issue for them from day one.
Right. And again, let's put it like this. As a professor, to simplify this, if a student comes and asks for an extension, maybe I give it to them if the reasoning makes sense. But if they come back again and ask for another extension, and then they ask for another extension, at a certain point, you might say, okay, this student might never get the work done. But that's exactly what's happened with Brightline and their multiple attempts of asking for extensions on bonds. And at a certain point, the problem isn't everything else, it's you. And I don't think they've really come to that conclusion yet in terms of asking for additional extensions.
Right. It feels like at this point that they have they're leasing that Virgin name because they actually hope people just say, "Oh, it's Virgin," and they won't look any further into it.
Right.
But I think these investors will, and particularly with the private activity bonds, they have to be sold in $100,000 blocks, and not just anybody can purchase those.
Right.
Unlike the stock.
So that, and again, part of the reason for doing that is to try to cater to institutional investors. And in other cases, to some extent, using the Virgin name, for lack of better words, it has a lot of name recognition overseas in Europe and other countries or other continents. And because of that, maybe they're hoping to get more international investment by bringing Virgin in. And maybe those people haven't been looking at the actual project itself.
And that could be, and you're absolutely right, Virgin is a well-known name over in Europe, of course. Although I will say Richard Branson has had some issues with the Virgin trains over in Europe as well.
Yes.
So, and it was using taxpayer money and the government having to bail them out as well. So,
correct.
We'll see how this all plays out. I don't think that changing the name, this is just my opinion, but I don't think changing the name changes any bit of the risk, nor smart investors. It's not going to fool them. They're going to look at this project to see what their return on investment could possibly be. That's what everybody wants. They want to make money.
Right. Exactly.
So let's talk a little bit more too about number 10, Iggy, the risk. The company's limited revenue and may not be able to generate sufficient cash to service the Series 2018 bonds. We've kind of been talking about this. This goes with the ridership that's already happened this year. They lost over $100 million in 2018.
Right.
And the losses have been climbing each quarter is the other interesting part about this.
Right.
And they have these 2018 bonds they need to service. So,
and I think the interesting thing is that so the ridership has increased and they're losing more money. And part of it is, and that demonstrates the fact that they've had to incentivize things so heavily to get more people on the trains that they're actually taking a greater loss. So a lot of people thought, okay, if the ridership increases, then usually the financial revenue coming in should increase also. But in this case, due to the heavy incentives to get people to ride the train, they're actually losing more money than they were months ago.
And they're still having a difficult time getting ridership. I think what I find is interesting too is I know a lot of people that have tried the train, but they try it once.
Right.
And that's the big problem is this isn't a mode of transportation that people are using every day.
Right.
And it's expensive to use every day if you wanted to. So
and that's the issue is the novelty aspect is that people try it once. It's similar to a new restaurant opens up and you go there, and if you have a great experience, you might go again. But you might go and you might say, we have a bunch of other seafood restaurants or whatever the case might be. So the issue with Brightline is that's a very expensive restaurant that if people don't keep coming back, they're going to lose an extensive amount of money.
And that's what's happening here. And, that's the final number 11 here, Iggy, is the risk. The value of the collateral securing the Series 2018 bonds may not be sufficient to satisfy the company obligations under the senior loan agreement and the Series 2018 bonds. That's really what this is coming down to.
It is that they don't have enough to offset the costs that they've already put into the project. And so the project is essentially already in trouble, and we'll see if they have to keep extending the IPO or what might come of that in the coming weeks and days.
Yes, this IPO that was supposed to be released tomorrow is going to be very interesting. Clearly, they were looking for $600 million, which was enough to service those 2018 bonds.
Right.
Coincidentally, not. But but we'll see what happens now with that. And Dr. Segner, thank you so much for coming in. I do have your paper posted on Florida Not All Aboard. It's a very interesting read, and appreciate you and your associate professor. That's the correct way to call him. Thank you very much for all the research that you both did. Very in depth. We covered just 23 minutes, but we could talk a long time about all the research you did.
There's a lot there. So maybe another time.
Yes, I will have you back again. Next week, we have a really great announcement from Commissioner Bob Solari from Indian River County. He's got a great announcement for everybody. So tune in again next week. Commissioner Bob Solari will be in the studio. Dr. Segner, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.